part of Democracy, two of the readings assigned for this week deal with various aspects of democracy moving slowly into the U.S., government setting, dealing with U.S. parties a little more specifically, but primarily the founding thoughts about democracy, drawing heavily on the Federalist Papers, which hopefully at some point in high school or previously you've heard of, but they are still incredibly important for understanding the foundation of our country, but also for constitutional liberal democracy generally. So, in opening, I just want to make a few comments on the specific readings by Plattner and the chapter on political democracy, highlighting some of the parts that Madison and Jefferson talk about, because there's still some difference of opinion and interpretation about how they interpreted things like equality, the reasons for it. The chapter 12 goes into, on political democracy, goes into a little more detail and simplification, arguing that Madison basically argued for equality of outcome, which was not really the case, but has come to be the one of the lead motifs in the Democratic Party in the United States, whereas the argument was there that Hamilton and Jefferson argued for individual liberty only and free market capitalism, which is not really the case, but has come to be, in a simplified term, simplified view, more associated with the Republican Party. But a few pointers on Plattner, because this is important, because it doesn't just relate to democracy in the U.S., but democracy generally, and why we see across the globe that whenever people have a choice to choose how they want to be governed, they have inevitably chosen some form of representative government. They have chosen some form of where they have leaders speaking on their behalf and people making decisions on their behalf with the retained right to change or modify or remove them at any point. And when people have had that choice freely and not had sort of limits or restraints, but have had a choice of how to put up a government system, that is what they've chosen. Now, there are a few things here in the Plattner parts, beginning with the Journal of Democracy article, that are important to bring up, and that's the inherent contestation we mentioned before between majority rule and individual liberty. The basic premise of a liberal democracy, as in ideologically liberal democracy, as in constitutional democracy. I know that the word liberal is used in three different settings in here and in political science in general. And again, because we have chosen to use the word liberal very differently in the United States in the modern setting, it can be confusing. But here, when we talk about a liberal democracy, when we talk about a constitutional democracy, when we talk about a system where you have a basic set of rules, a basic set of laws from which other laws follow, we're talking about liberal in the sense of freedom, opportunity, of an open system, the way classical liberalism thinks about it. When we talk about liberals, quote unquote, in the modern setting, as is remarked in one of the two chapters, or the chapter, excuse me, as in a liberal Democrat, we're referring to the type of big government supportive liberals that only exist in the United States. So again, I have not made these distinctions up to make it deliberately confusing. This is a terminology that has ingrained itself in the American vernacular and thus made it more confusing than it need to be. But in political science and in any general argument about politics and ideas, liberalism, going back to the classical liberal ideas of free market capitalism and competition and individual choices, is what we mean by a liberal democracy, one based upon constitution, based upon laws stemming from there, based upon equality of justice and equality of in a court of justice. But there are inherent contradictions in democracy that we may not always think about that makes what we tend to believe are gridlock and so on actually an inherent part of government. Because gridlock cannot exist if you don't have democracy. Inability to cooperate can't exist if you don't have democracy. If you impose your view and impose your will through an authoritarian regime, you have an easier way of governing. It's actually a lot easier to put a gun to someone's head and say, do this, than trying to convince someone that you're correct or convince a bunch of people to follow your lead. And the inherent contradiction between allowing people to get a majority of votes and safeguarding individual rights or the minority rights, as in the minority of people who did not prevail, who did not win, is an inherent contradiction. Because on the one hand, those who win should have the right to propose laws to change society. That's what elections are about. You get a majority, you have the right to govern, you have the right to make changes. On the other hand, you have no right to take away my basic guaranteed freedoms, and you have no right to squash your opposition. And those things are inherently difficult to balance. Because if the majority wants something that is very, very different than those who lost in the last election, but yet have to respect those who lost, who can't just take away everything they have, they can't just walk over them, it makes change difficult. You compare that to an authoritarian regime or a totalitarian regime where one person says, this is what's going to happen. If you don't agree with me, I'll kill you. End of story. That's a lot easier. So democracy have those inherent tensions, and that was brought up by Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson early on in our founding fathers debate and in the Federalist Papers as well. Then he goes on to talk a little bit about populism and multiculturalism after explaining sort of what republicanism means, this representative type of government. Now, we have a republic, and we'll get back to that again in a few weeks. I hope you all are familiar. We don't have, in the strictest sense, a pure democracy. In fact, aside from, one could say, Switzerland is probably the closest you can get, you really only have representative systems today. And we have equated that with democracy because inherent in every representative system is your right, in this room or anywhere else, to get enough support to change those who govern. That's inherent in any representative system. And therefore, this notion of democracy, the governance by people, is still intact. To put it this way, to move on a little bit into the other chapter that I wanted to comment on specifically, Madison, Hamilton, and Jefferson all spoke about inequality. If 1% of the American population, hypothetically, owns 50% of the assets, they still only have one vote each in that percent. So while the economic power may be concentrated, inherent in any representative democracy is that the other 99% have 99% of the votes. So political power should balance economic power. And in systems where democracy doesn't exist, the power of economics and the almighty rich group dictates also what happens elsewhere. Inherent in democracy is that you can actually change that configuration if you choose to, if you get enough supporters on your side to do so. After a while, we tired of taxing people at 90% in the 1950s, so we changed that, etc. So those are inherent tensions in democracy anywhere. The populism that he talks about and multiculturalism are two aspects that pop up anywhere where you have the right to free speech. But as Plattner also mentions, it's not always easy just to say, this is what we want to do, come up with a popular message and get enough people to support you and then actually implement something. Maybe you're good enough an orator. Maybe you're convincing enough that you do get elected. Maybe your party runs on a populist agenda about highfalutin goals that can never be implemented. But at some point, you actually have to do something with it. And if you don't, next time around, you're going to be voted out. So populism is always going to exist as long as you have freedom of speech. The question is whether or not you can actually turn it into something constructive that actually works within a constitutional democracy, a system where you actually adhere to those basic respects for minorities that have lost election and for individual rights. Now, in the chapter on political democracy and the origin of the two-party system in the United States, it talks first about political parties and goes specifically into Madison, draws upon the Federalist Papers that Plattner also does, about how inherently political parties were not thought necessary. They were all even thought evil. They called them factions because they would galvanize people into different groups and cooperation would be impossible. Governance would be impossible. But unlike some previous thinkers, Madison, and supported by Jefferson and Hamilton later, actually thought you can't really do away with it. You can't ban people. That's inherently against any freedom of speech. You can't ban parties. And in fact, they are going to evolve. They are going to emerge. So you're just going to have to deal with them. You have to live with them. And you're going to have to address this notion of factions as they exist. On page 128, going on of Freedom of Power, the chapter that I assigned, I'm going to highlight a few things here. When he starts talking about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party's base in the Federalist Papers, few thinkers, few American historians would agree with his extreme interpretation of Madison. What Madison was referring to was not equality of outcome as in Marx, but the same thing as Thomas Jefferson did in 1785 when he wrote to Madison about the inequality that existed and prevented capitalism, prevented workers from actually making use of their talent. That extreme inequality is actually preventing liberal democracy from functioning. It's preventing laborers from actually getting employment so that they can actually make use of their talent. Washington later on in 1796 spoke about how an educated workforce, an educated populace was necessary also to counter extreme inequality and allow the population, to contribute to a functioning liberal democracy, constitutional democracy. So he's taken this to the extreme when he talks about Madison's formulation of the liberal credo boiled down to each according to his need. Only if you put it in the context of you and I, as average laborers, can't make use of our talent. We can't contribute. We can't make use of the opportunities in an open society unless there's a possibility to do so. And if a small minority own every piece of asset and hold down those who try to compete, you can't do so. Jefferson wrote that, Washington, Madison, Hamilton. So it's not a Marxist type of equality. The exaggerated outcome here is to exemplify in a simplified version a basic difference between the Democrats and Republicans today. There's no doubt, there's absolutely no doubt that there is a vast majority in the Democratic Party today that emphasizes justice as in equal outcome, much more so than in the Republican Party. No doubt. But justice has a whole host of other meanings. It's not an equal outcome today that is the main component of that. Equal treatment under the law, equal opportunity. But the larger point that is absolutely more emphasized in the Democratic Party, yes. And the emphasis on individual liberty, choice, and opportunity as in self-interest as a way of improving society is absolutely more emphasized in the Republican Party. Yeah. And this debate boils down to, one could argue, how do we better make use of the talents and the resources and the assets that is, you and everyone else, myself included? Is it by providing through the collective, through government, some form of equal opportunity and support? Or is it by stepping back and allowing people to decide for themselves how to best make use of the resources? That remains at the heart of the questions between most Democrats and most Republicans today. And it remains at the heart of the question in most every democratic system. Should we have a larger collective or a smaller collective? Should we have more individual decisions on what to do with our resources, or should we have more collective decisions on that? That's absolutely part of the main discussion in any democracy. And the inherent recognition that diversity of opinion, the other part of Madison's argument for allowing factions, allowing parties, diversity of opinions, that is, the formulation of different groups with different ideas and different opinions, acts to create that very debate, that very argument that is necessary in democracy, acts to check power, to balance power. So instead of arguing that factions or parties is inherently opposite liberal democracy, it actually supports it. Because you prevent the all-encompassing power of a tyrant from ascending to power. So allowing for different opinions, allowing for different views, allowing for different ideas actually safeguards liberal democracies, not counters it. So here's the departure from Montesquieu and to a certain extent Rousseau as well. And why do we bring this up again and again? Because it is the founding ideas of our country, of our democracy, of our system in which you are a participant. And you may leave this course ultimately say, I don't care what people do with my tax money. I don't care what anyone else does with my resources. I don't care what they do with my property. I'm just going to go do something else and they can take whatever money they need. That's your choice. Or you can participate in a minimum way of at least informing yourself and choosing to elect those who best represent what you think is correct. Or get involved, like a lot of people do, in a particular cause for which you feel deeply. Because ultimately, the one thing that you will leave here understanding is that whether or not you think the whole notion of how we govern ourselves is important, the country does not look the same today as it did 50 years ago, and it does not look the same as it did 100 years ago. And someone has done something to change something. So if you're not going to do it, someone else is. That much everyone, I think, can agree upon. So inherent contradictions, the movement, the basic differences of the parties. We will have every opportunity to get back to those two readings as well. And of course, Hillary Clinton's brief expose of the power of technology to disseminating ideas is just a modern version of this. An educated, informed populace use technology, or technology provides information in a reciprocal manner that allows people to stand up for their ideas in ways they couldn't before, overcoming the fear that 10 people or 50 people in a group will be clamped down on, but 500,000 or even 50,000 will not. So it exemplifies the power of democratic ideas even in authoritarian systems in North Africa and the Middle East, simply because you have a means by which to transmit those ideas and get enough people out. Now, if a 20-year-old in Egypt and Libya are willing to risk their lives for the idea of democracy, not a job, not a paycheck, not a guaranteed life in luxury, but actually real hardship for the time to come, then there must be something about this idea that really, really resonates with people. Because there are hundreds of thousands of people every year who get maimed or killed simply because they want the idea of the right to speak up and the right to vote and the right to choose who governs themselves. So there must be something that is inherently attractive in this. I put this up. You can look it up. It's just to emphasize what Thomas Jefferson wrote to Madison, commenting on what is brought up by Madison's thoughts about how inequality takes away the opportunities, and therefore active participation, parties, ideas, and the free flow of competition actually helps to ensure that a liberal democracy or constitutional democracy actually works. And Jefferson is simply commenting on his observations that you cannot really have participation, you can't really have competition, you can't actually have a free system if those who want to participate, those who want to compete, don't have the opportunity to do so. Observing the fact that most people don't have land, most people don't have property, and that inequality prevents competition and the functioning of a liberal democracy. I'll put that up if you want to read the entire. It's a brief letter he wrote in 1785 that's available online too. So we talk about how our parties had their founding ideas in liberal democracy, but the two parties have sort of taken two different paths of how we want to get to a functioning constitutional democracy, either with a larger public sector, larger collective, or a smaller. Larger the Democratic Party, primarily. Smaller the Republican Party, primarily. Although, of course, as we'll see, and I think many of you know, there are areas within government that the Republicans want to be really, really, really big, and there are areas in the government that the Democrats want to be really, really, really small. So there's no real 100% consistency. But we have two big umbrella parties in the United States. But if you go out in the rest of the world, in equally democratic systems, from Finland to Spain, from Ireland to New Zealand or Australia, you will find a lot of countries that have a lot of different parties. And I mentioned before, when you write a constitution, it's sort of like a smorgasbord. Look at your own culture, your own people, your own history. What suits us? What do we want to eat? Not all of it, but you pick and choose. And so countries that have a wide, diverse set of ideas for a variety of reasons have oftentimes become multi-party systems. Parties that have divergent regional interests, like we had, we tend to forget that today, but a trip down south or northwest, you'll find that pretty quickly. But we had a federal system because our states were very prominent. They had different ideas, they had different rules, they had different backgrounds. So a federal system was natural for us. Today, countries like India and Brazil and Germany that had very similar reasons for this also are federalist systems. Canada. Some of them have 20 parties, like in Israel. Some of them have 5. Some of them have 2 chambers, like we have. Some of them have 1. Some have a president and prime minister, like France. Some have just a prime minister, which is a sort of a first among equals that sits in government. The point here is not to go into detail on these, because we'll get back to these when you look in comparative setting. The point here is these are all different institutions within democracies. And almost all of these countries are equally democratic, equally, with the slight exception of Brazil there, equally free for individuals, but they have very different ways of dividing up power, checking on power, or expressing their ideas and contestation of ideas, because they have different number of parties, different numbers of chambers, different divisions of power. But in all of those, aside from the partial exception of Brazil yet, which is working towards it, you have constitutions that guarantee freedom, you have laws that stem from them, you have free and fair elections, you have the peaceful turnover of powers, you have a free media, you have control over power, just like we're accustomed to in the United States. And some of them are ranked much higher of freedom of the press and transparency and less corruption as well. And I'll bring up some of those a little later as well. just one example, if you look at, and this is one of many agencies, think tanks, organizations that rank how free countries are, political freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of the media, a little less corruption or more corruption. Basically, how free are you to do what you want, say what you want, and act like you want, without harming others, of course. And they change from year to year, and this is, as said, one. You can look at a variety of others. The Heritage Foundation on Economic Freedom, World Economic Freedom, press freedom, etc. We'll see later. The point here is not to memorize any of this. The point is just to show you that there are countries that are close to or similarly free to us. Some of them have more shaky basis, like Mali, that has gone back and forth. And some are very sound, like in Western Europe and North America. But there are large swaths of the world where people really can't speak up, they can't say what they want, they can't address their concerns without fear of repercussions. And most people in the world still live in countries where they don't have the basic freedoms that we assume in the United States. Just take China and India, and you have India is mostly in that area. There are small parts of it that isn't. But China and Russia and large swaths of Africa are still nowhere close to what we would assume as free democracies. Other aspects of equality and opportunity, we mentioned this a little bit when we looked at feminism, is the number of women in the legislatures. And if you look here, this is just a general comparison. I'm not going to ask you about the specific numbers. There's no sense in memorizing specific numbers. But it's a general sense of the fact that there's progress made. There's progress made in different parts of the world. But there is a large overlap between being democratic and having female participation in the legislature. Now, of course, China's presence here and the United Arab Emirates are two exceptions because they have forcefully done so just to look good. There's no democratic elections. There are no free competition to get into these legislators. But it's nonetheless a sort of a general indication of the correlation between democratic systems and female participation. If you think back to this, if I were to show you this 30 years ago, all of this, aside from Uruguay, all of South America, would be yellow or purple. None of them would be green aside from Uruguay. Africa, same thing. Bangladesh, absolutely. India would be moving towards green. Indonesia, absolutely purple. Brutal military authoritarian regime. In other words, and Mongolia, same thing. In other words, we would have North America, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. That would basically be it. 30 years on, today, you have a lot more green. So there must be some reason why people have moved in these directions. There must be some reason why countries have transitioned in. Yeah, it pays off because other big players in the world say, you can become democratic, we'll trade with you, you'll get more money. It's an incentive, absolutely. But you can't create democracies. Britain tried it in Afghanistan, we tried it in Afghanistan, Britain tried it in Bangladesh. It doesn't work. You can't impose free will. You can't impose people's sense of participation, right? No, it's a contradiction in term. You can't impose on someone who doesn't want it or where there's no majority for wanting it. Yeah, you should have the right to speak up. Here, go do it. It just doesn't work. It has to be generic. It has to be inherent in the people themselves. All of these countries went through it. We went through it, Canada, Western Europe, of course. So what is it? I mean, for some reason, countries are transitioning. They're making a step from either totalitarian systems to authoritarian to democratic in some form of or fashion. And it's difficult. It's incredibly difficult. Brazil went through 3 attempts back and forth before there was sufficient support amongst the population and influential groups to accept that people can express their wills in elections, and those elections actually matter, and the laws on the books actually are enforced. For a long time, when countries transition, people are worried. Business people will lose their influence. Leaders will lose power. I mean, it's partly understandable. People have interest that they have gained, monetary, political interest, and they're afraid of losing those. People don't know what democracy entails. Remember, for those of you who are psych majors, there is nothing that scares a human being more than change. The unknown is the greatest fear factor known to humankind. If you know something dreadful is going to happen, you still feel better because you can plan for it and you can take whatever precautions you can. But the unknown, the fear of unknown, change is incredibly scary. And if you're going to change your country's system, you've learned to live with repression. You've learned to live under oppressive regimes. If you go back and watch films about East Germany or Czechoslovakia or Chile under the communist rule and Pinochet's rule, you'll see how even in the film, or if you read books about it, people adapted. They knew where they could talk. They took precautionary measures. They turned up music when they were in their apartments to prevent the bugging. You adapt. Humans are incredibly adaptive. But all of a sudden, what? We're supposed to be expressing our ideas freely? I don't like what you say. How do I know that this is going to be better? And today, when even in poorer countries, or in undemocratic countries like China, or Pakistan, or many parts of Africa, everyone has a cell phone. We're not unique in that. There are dozens and dozens of countries that have far more cell phones per person than the United States. And that gives you access to information around the world. And you see that people are walking the streets in Paris with luxury handbags. And people are driving new cars in the streets of Strasbourg. I live in an authoritarian regime. You tell me that democracy is better. I want what you have, and I want it now. I don't want to wait 10 years. I don't want to sacrifice a whole bit. So it's also the problem of how long do we have to wait? How much do we have to sacrifice? Because it's very easy to sit in a comfortable chair in Washington or Brussels or Sydney or somewhere else, say, you do X, Y, and Z, and you'll have democracy eventually, and you'll be better off. That's very easy. It's more difficult to actually implement it on the ground, even though we've come a long way in understanding what to do and what to advise people to do. But somehow along the way, countries transition. Is there one reason why countries transition from non-democratic to democratic? Myanmar is doing it right now. You're watching a video on it next week. It used to be one of the most closed-off military dictatorships in the world for several decades. And in less than 24 months, it has turned around and is rapidly moving towards democracy. It's not there yet by any means, but it's rapidly moving. It's doing up to investments, it's changed its constitution, it held elections. That, they have a very different reason for doing so than countries in Eastern Europe, where the yoke of communism was removed when the Soviet Union fell, or Chile, where Pinochet ruled. In other words, why countries move from undemocratic to what we call democratic systems is different. But once there's some starting point, right now in the news, you can't pick up a paper without reading about Ukraine. Close to 100,000 people have camped out in harsh winter climates for months in the main square in Kiev, come from all across the country, to protest what they consider an unacceptable move by the president to side with Russia over the Europeans. They want freedom. They want access to the European continent. They want access to trade. They want to be European. They feel European. They want democracy to continue. They don't want to side with Russia, which they see as authoritarian and not in their interest. In 2004, hundreds of thousands of people stood up against the then authoritarian government in Ukraine as well, equally peacefully for months on end, forced the government to resign, and had free elections. And then actually made a whole host of progress, setting up free elections, free parties, relatively free media, property rights, free constitution. But they show how difficult it is, because the last president started accumulating a lot of powers of his own, started moving closer to Russia, started clamping down on the press, started taking steps that very much are undemocratic and unconstitutional. So now hundreds of thousands of people again protested, sacrificing other income and time and so on, because they want to have a liberal democracy, a constitutional democracy. So Ukraine is very much an example of how difficult it is to move to a full-fledged democratic system. We tend to forget in the United States, we didn't have democracy when our Constitution was adopted. We didn't have democracy in the 1840s, 1850s, 1880s, and 1890s. Under no definition of a modern democracy would we have qualified. We had no right for women to vote, no right for minorities. Well, we had it on paper, de facto it was not. All the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, they took until 1965 to be applicable at the state level. Not 1865, not 1795, 1965. So, before the last one was adopted at the state level. So democracy is difficult. And it's difficult to put yourself in that situation unless you're actually living it today. Yes, sir?
What would be an example where a country did the reverse and transitioned from a democracy to a non-democracy?
None have done so for a longer period of time. Greece became a military junta in 1960s, I believe. In other words, and Turkey has had the military take over and set aside all constitutional rights 4 times. In other words, there have been democracies that have been unstable enough that the military or military groups that are not the formal military have stepped in, set aside formal laws, and set aside the Constitution. That has happened on a number of occasions. The hallmark of a country where that couldn't happen is what we call a consolidated democracy. And that's where the thought of the military stepping in, first of all, the military is under civilian rule, not military rule. That's why we have a civilian commander-in-chief, and so do most all democratic system. But where there is not that, even if the worst case scenario, if parties are completely gridlocked, the economy tanks, unemployment skyrockets, we're threatened with war, we're hit with a terrorist attack, the military will not take over. Civilian rule applies, and basic laws, even if there are ways in which, even in the United States, we can declare the states of emergency and you can actually set aside certain rights. Well, here's why you would argue that we are. Because the way in which you can set aside those laws, your individual freedoms, are, well, they're in writing. They are clear to everyone. You know what those procedures would be. You can look them up online or go look in a congressional library. I know what they are. And whether this gentleman was president or this woman was president, they would still apply under a given circumstance. So therefore, it's not arbitrary. It's not dependent on who's in power. It's not dependent upon someone's arbitrary will. And if there is enough support in the elected legislator to change those procedures for when those emergency laws apply, you can do so. But that doesn't apply in countries where there is no constitutional guaranteed rights. Now, ultimately, in theory, sure, can the president go berserk in order, bombs to be dropped on his own people? Theoretically, maybe it can happen. In Britain, as we'll see later, yes, the government is, in theory, almighty. They can, in theory, do anything they want as long as they have a majority. But for 900 years, that hasn't happened. The same, in theory, applies in Sweden, but for 550 years, it hasn't happened. So there's some inherent acceptance, psychologically, that you accept that there is freedom of competition. Some win, some lose. So it's also an ideational acceptance that if I lose an election, I won't take up a gun and take over power. When Al Gore lost in 2000, he was the fourth president who won the popular election but lost the Electoral College. Go read his speech. Not because it's a Republican or Democrat. He happens to be a Democrat. But read his speech that he gave the day after the court had decided to step in for the first time in history and say, the recount is over, George Bush has won. He talks about how in democracies we accept the outcome of the judiciary, we don't take up arms, we respect those who lose, we go on to fight another day. And this is a president presidential candidate who arguably had a lot to argue in his favor. Popular election, ongoing recount, court has never stepped in before, okay? But he accepted. Now, in a shaky country, that wouldn't have happened. So there are safeguards and there are mental acceptance of those safeguards. Mexico said it was a democracy since 1919, but the first time it had a change of power was 80 years later. And then it had 2 more changes of power. And that's when people really started talking about Mexico as a consolidated democracy, because they had peaceful turnover of powers 3 times. And this acceptance that democracy is the only game in town really is psychological. It's not written down. You can't teach people that. People have to accept the fact that if you lose and someone else wins, you peacefully step aside and you allow someone else to govern. And you try to fight another time or another issue. And these countries, yes, sir?
Has any elected official taken a look at these actions that are set in place in national disaster in our country?
Oh yeah, we do them all the time.
I mean, if someone, a president elected, whoever has the ability to change them, have they tried to ratify them?
Well, there are rules and procedures.
They
Yeah.
can be changed.
Oh yes.
Popular vote.
Yeah. If Congress wants to modify them, we've. When it comes to national security legislation, there are laws that apply to the groups and the positions in government that have authorization to act. There are procedures in place. For example, when you look at Congress, the heads of the intelligence services in the House and the Senate, whoever they are, have the right to be briefed on any issue where the president takes executive order or any other type of national security issues behind closed doors. There's a check that they don't override their authority. So if the president orders covert action, the intelligence committees have the right to be informed. And if they are not, they hold hearings on it. There have been hearings on issues related to actions in Afghanistan in public because the intelligence committee's chairs didn't think that they were informed. And there are a whole host of prerogatives that members of both the House and the Senate have to get more information. They can issue subpoenas to White House staff, and they have to testify.
So there's never been a real serious push to change one specific.
I don't know the details of what specific legislation has been changed. I know that in light of the fact that you have,
I was just wondering
Yeah.
if someone that maybe wasn't like not even a popular vote. That's what they based maybe their election on, saying that we want to.
Oh yes,
this if we get in,
the Patriot Act from 2001 has been an election issue ever since. In there are clearly stipulated criteria for how and when you can search individuals' properties, American citizens' properties, non-American citizens and Americans' communication. Those have been modified several times. Hearings have been held. People have run on elections to try to force changes. They've been reauthorized with modifications 3 times. Those are clear examples of how national security legislation had changed in accordance with evolution, both of technology and what we consider acceptable. Then, right now, there's a widespread debate about whether or not certain surveillance techniques by a national security agency that we have are actually constitutional, let alone acceptable. There is a political question about acceptance, and then there are other legal questions. And they're fair game. They're discussed in hearings. They're discussed by commentators. The president has weighed in. They have reviews. So the fact that you can have that debate, whereas in, say, a country like Iran, you don't hear about that. That just changes. It's not something that anyone would have any input on for any reason at any point in time. There is no such, stipulated division of power or authority. You just have a secret service or secret agency do it. Yes, sir.
Countries in Europe just get mad and basically threaten to not be as close with the United States. We didn't change those laws because we were spying on their head of state.
Did countries in Europe get upset because we're spying? Yes, they did. Yes. And there are 2 short responses to that. First, there's a great deal of hypocrisy and, in the truest sense, playing to your own population, because the French intelligence services and the British intelligence services spy back, absolutely. And there is an unwritten code, and you can ask any intelligence officer about this, that if you spy on other diplomats, you do not release it in public, as the Russians did with the U.S. ambassador on her comments about Europe last week, when she said, and something I can't say on camera, about the Europeans. You just don't do that. That was the only comment. Not denying it, not saying that she didn't say it or was wrong or anything. Just, you don't do that.
Do you not insulted feel that way?
No, but the French, the Germans, the Brits, and other Europeans are upset. But the smaller countries that don't have the capacity are not upset because they don't know they can't do that. And the French population know that they have a very sophisticated spying service themselves that they built up both in their colonial territories that they had before and through cooperation with others like the U.S. and Britain. And there's no doubt. I mean, think of this. The fact is that most Brits are not upset because Britain has top-level security clearance officers sitting at the NSA and the CIA in the United States, and we have the opposite, and vice versa. We have an agreement from 1947 between the U.S., Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, not to spy on each other, but to share all information between ourselves. So it's a little bit of hypocrisy, but it's also playing to your own domestic population, because you don't want to go to say your own population, yeah, we're fine with the Americans listening in on your telephone calls here in Germany. It doesn't play very well. So there are both things. But the fact remains is Americans have been helped by British and French intelligence in preventing terrorist attacks. The Europeans have been helped multiple times by our intelligence gathering to prevent terrorist attacks and other things. So there's no one at the serious level that proposes seriously severing these ties, because ultimately we're all worried about China and Pakistan and Russia and a few other and Middle Eastern countries, because they are far worse than anything that Americans or Europeans do to each other. Yes, Mac.
I was just going to chime in to what you just said, actually. I thought that was more of a farce when I heard that France and Britain, and I think Germany also, but Germany is kind of different than France and Britain.
Yes. No, it is. They have the right to be upset when they target heads of government, not.
It seems like a political thing versus like it actually being pissed off, versus, like we all can spy on each other,
Yes.
but a politician can't say that we can spy on them.
No. Well, no. So there's more than meets the eye when it comes to this, and the fact is, it doesn't look good on us, irrespective, that we have been targeting the telephone of one of our closest allies at a time when there has been no mutual threat or any other problems. The fact it comes across as being sort of, well, we do it because we can. And there's a legitimate question to be asked. First of all, what do you gain by tapping the phone of Merkel or Lipponen or some other Western ally? On the other hand, it is more sort of for the show of the domestic public, which is important because we all know that perceptions matter. Perceptions matter far more than reality. If perceptions didn't matter more than reality, politics would be very easy. Distortions wouldn't exist, myths wouldn't exist, misperceptions wouldn't exist. No one in the U.S. would call Sweden and Germany socialist if misperceptions didn't exist, if myths didn't exist. So perceptions matter, and the perception that you have the leader of the strongest economy in the world being bugged by the NSA, it gives a little. It doesn't play well when you then need their cooperation with Russia, with Pakistan, with India, with China, etc. So there's both the reality and the image problem they have. And it's a legitimate question to ask. If you have the most powerful spying agency in the world at your disposal, and you, as it appears, can reach cell phones basically anywhere, is there a limit to what you should use that power for and how? And how many should have access to oversight over it? As it appears, we have perhaps a problem with having 3 million top-level security clearance issues, or how many it is. That's a whole host of people. Maybe there are too many. Maybe it needs to be looked at, but the fact that you can have an open debate over who should have access to this information, and the fact that contractors can have access to top-level security clearance, is maybe a legitimate concern. But that occurs in a democracy. Otherwise, we don't have the Snowden leak. But that occurs in a democracy. It doesn't occur in Iran or Saudi Arabia or somewhere else. Yes, sir?
So when you want to look at everyone that has these clearances, you know who has the clearances then, right? Maybe you want to alter who has them.
We'll get back to this in 2 weeks, but suffice to say...
You understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
You have to know everyone
Yes.
who has it then.
You have 1,100 agencies, companies, and contract entities that work in national security just after 9/11. 1,100, not 11, not one, but have some access to national security classified information. And you have over 3 million people at various levels in government, including, of course, the military, that have access to various levels of security clearance. That's a lot of people. And we don't make people keep quiet by the threat of a gun. You sign a non-disclosure form. That's it. So humans have a tendency, especially the more you have of them that have the same information, to not always abide by what they say. So, you can look into, we've prosecuted and sentenced numerous people over time for leaking security information. Yes, sir?
It's like one out of every 100 people.
Yes.
It's like a small state. Like they just hand
Various
them out.
levels. You have many, many different levels of security clearance, of course. So, one last question, then we'll move on. Yeah, sir.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Top secret.
Yeah.
Top secret.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you have various levels. Absolutely. But it has changed, of course, because when our chair, Jeff Weber, had top security clearance, you had to go into a bunker, you saw hard copies, and you couldn't take it out. Today you have jump drives, you have computers, you have emails, you have faxes, you have ways of interaction that proliferate the information. And we're still humans. We're still the same humans as we were 50,000 years ago. We just have different technologies to work with. And, as we've seen, Sometimes people have various reasons to leak information for a variety of reasons that may or may not be appropriate. But that wouldn't happen, for example, in China. China is moving. China is an anomaly today. It is authoritarian in the sense that you have thousands of web pages that you can't read. You have thousands of sources of information that you're not allowed to access, that you're not allowed to discuss. But on the other hand, they're allowing hundreds of protests every day across the country. They have conceded some things on, say, environmental issues and pollution because people are getting fed up. They have allowed small local elections. They have set up what's called capitalist free zones in the southeast. So China really doesn't fit the mold of any particular, what we historically associate with authoritarian or totalitarian regime. It's gradually trying to find its way, as they call it, at state-led development. And with 1.2 billion people, what China does, regardless of anything else, does have an effect on the rest of the world simply because of their size. If 1.2 billion people want a new shirt, that takes an awful lot of cotton. If 800 million people want to drive a new car, it would take a decade to produce them all. I mean, there's just the sheer size means that it's not like reinventing Finland after World War II. It didn't have a profound impact on the world economy. Yes, sir.
Isn't what they're doing? I remember learning when China blocks certain websites, like maybe, for example, like Tiananmen Square, like they can't learn about that. It's like kind of breeding ignorance, like they don't know what happened.
But the hallmark of a totalitarian system and a necessity in an authoritarian system, a totalitarian system is basically where you have no right to speak up, associate, or choose where you travel. In most cases, like Belarus and North Korea, you're not allowed to travel with a few exceptions.
Right to know,
No. There is no internet access, state-controlled TV, official, that is. In authoritarian regimes, you basically just, as long as you do not threaten the regime, as long as you don't propagate information about the regime that is opposed to the regime, as long as you don't pose a threat in any way to the regime in place, then you're allowed to exist and travel and so on. And that's where China basically fits in.
And what we learned in here, that we adopt whatever Texas or California wants to put in the textbooks because of money. We want to save as much as we can by printing less books.
Okay.
And we're sacrificing and forming students for money.
Well, what the states in the United States, the subnational legislators choose to spend tax money on
To get a good deal.
Is subject to a very simple thing: people voting in someone else. If in California they just voted, as I said, in a referendum to tax themselves even more, but to ring fence that taxing for education. Now that's a choice that people have made. In many parts of this country, you would be hard-pressed to put such a proposal to the population and get a majority acceptance. They will say, well, having a modified interpretation of U.S. history, well, we can get other information in other places if we want, or spending more money on public schools that are already costing a lot of money. I don't think that. I'm putting forth an argument that is constantly being weighed. And so the difference is, in China, there's a national agency says, this is what you learn. This is what our history says. This is what our neighbors did to us. This is how we reacted. We did not kill millions of people in 1949. We did not have a government expel. Taiwan is illegal. Tiananmen Square was not a freedom protest. It was not a democracy movement, etc. The same applies, by the way, to Serbian textbooks from 1997, 2007. They never massacred anyone. They never killed anyone. There were no mass graves. There were no slaughters. There was all fabrication. I've actually sat down with a Serbian educator and go through this. It's like reading some science fiction novel. They've changed them now, but for a decade, that entire history of 1992 to 1997 with mass slaughters were completely obliterated.
And you think we do that
So, no, I'm not
Not-
equating.
yeah.
I'm not equating that. I'm
It's not equal to that, but
yes, sir.
Well, I was going to say, like, your point that you just vote people out on the textbook issue, I mean, I guess
No.
that's still a point. But if you're going to say that we don't lie, literally tweak history to be in our favor in this country, I mean, I think you'd be pushing it a little bit.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the difference is that you and anyone have the opportunity to tell your legislators, we want to spend more money and print our own textbooks and decide what goes into them. Because ultimately everything is a choice. What goes into any textbook is a choice. I choose what I put in my books, and I choose what to exclude. Ultimately you can't have an all-encompassing history of everything in anything you write. And that's why you have multiple sources. That's why I constantly encourage you, don't get your information from one source alone. And there's something I say, then in all means go out and check it against others. I mean, there are truths. Yes, there are absolute truths, but there are interpretations of reasons for why things happen that can never all be all-encompassing. Madison this day, as I said, are interpreted in different ways, their writings, right? You will see next week when you look at the videos on Myanmar, or as it's also called, Burma, how they're rapidly moving away from military dictatorship in a very unusual way. There wasn't a popular uprising. There wasn't a popular protest. There wasn't renewed external pressure. The military regime finally said, this is not working for us. This is just not working. And for a variety of reasons that ultimately will come out, I think, over time, decided to step aside to a large extent. The Central African Republic today is probably as bad as anywhere you'll get on Earth. Yes, and it is literally in the middle of the African continent. They have less doctors than anywhere on the planet, more disease, and greater poverty than almost anywhere else. And there's a military running the country. France has set in to try to stop some of the worst slaughter, along with developments in Mali. But there is, in fact, no real functioning government to deal with. One of the biggest paradises on earth for newlyweds and paradise vacations, Fiji, has been run under a military regime for the last 7 years. Nobody really cares. It's a small island nation that bothers no one. They live on tourism and fishing alone. And the tourist places are all open. So in the politics of international relations, nobody cares. The reality is, unfortunately, that if you live in a small place far away that is a threat to no one, the likelihood that anyone with real power and influence will care is very remote. That's unfortunately the reality of international relations. However, in these countries, the rest of the world really do care. Because in these countries, it's a religious-based authoritarian system. Yes, you're allowed to travel in and out, but you can't threaten the government in words. You can't publish something that they don't support. The elections are rigged, staged. The candidates are chosen by the religious leadership. And in Iran, although if you pick up the paper, we hear about the Iranian president, he's a little puppet figurehead that a clergy group of 17, headed by a master Ayatollah, actually run. They run the country. The president is a spokesperson. And in Saudi Arabia, it's a family since its founding that have run the country, a family of princes and kings that run the country. Are they anywhere close to democracy? Absolutely not. But like most authoritarian regimes, particularly theocracies, they have to get their money somewhere. And in these two instances, oil have provided all the influence, all the money they need to pay off their population. I'll give you one example of how easy it is to run an authoritarian. And when I say easy, I mean you don't have to bother with different ideas. You don't have to put up with the inevitable clashes of ideas. Just one second. When the uprising in North Africa from Tunisia to Libya to Egypt took place, and then there were uprisings in Bahrain, where we have a big fleet station, and we were really worried. Saudi Arabia decided, well, we're not going to allow any protests. But it looks really bad just to send out the military and shoot down protesters. So we're just going to buy everyone off. And when I say buy off, I mean literally buy off with hundreds of thousands of dollars per person. Here's cash, shut up. You're a student, you're someone who wants to go abroad and study. You could walk into any Saudi Arabian embassy anywhere in the world and get a cash of $100,000 on the spot. Shutting up and studying. There were pictures of people walking out of the Saudi Arabian embassy in London with swats of cash. So that's how you can pay off if you have a lot of money. Now they're realizing you can't go on like this forever, but they don't really know how to transition into something that's more viable in the long term. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, what's the difference between Saudi Arabia and Swaziland?
Swaziland, yes. Swaziland, the difference. Swaziland is the last remaining real monarchy in the world. Yes, there are monarchies in Northern Europe, but they don't have any power. They're just, they're just there for old time's sake. But in Swaziland, yes, there's the third descendant from the same king. He has, 14, 15 wives, thinks he descends from the elephants, and they live on cheap textile manufacturing. It's literally in the middle of northeastern part of South Africa. It's encircled by South Africa. So it's in the country of South Africa that you have this independent country of Swaziland. It's sort of like San Marino. If you go to Italy, San Marino is actually a small country in Italy surrounded by Italy. So nobody really cares about Swaziland other than they have cheap textile manufacturing, and human rights groups raise concerns because it's a lot worse than South Africa is. But they still have a pure monarch. The king is supreme, and no other voices are allowed. Now, Somalia and Congo represents two of those countries that government really collapsed. If you remember Black Hawk Down movie from '93, the failed U.S. incursion in Somalia in 1991, for 20 subsequent years, Somalia was without government. Various rebel groups, Somali Islamic groups have run the country. They have a nominal government now that controls only the capital, and that's it. But they're a failed country that can't sign agreements. They're not sovereign, and they can't sign agreements with anyone else. So all of these are different types of non-democratic regimes. You have authoritarian and totalitarian system. Authoritarian has a little more openness, a little more freedom to move, a little more freedom to choose what you want to do. But, yes, Belarus, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia are totalitarian in the sense you can't speak up, you're limited in what you can say, where you can go, etc. Not so much Saudi Arabia, pardon me, but Belarus and North Korea. But there are some advantages for leaders in here. And that's why they're able to continue. Because you ask yourself, why is it that they just continue them? First of all, they need money. And oil, or minerals, or gold provide that. Because the rest of the world needs it. That's the only reason why Putin is turning Russia back into authoritarian state. Because they have oil, gas, minerals that the rest of the world needs. In abundance. In addition to more fresh water than the rest of the world combined. Yes. It's the largest landmass in the world, and so it is a concern. But it's strong in the sense you don't have to bother with different ideas. You don't have to bother with different parties, as long as you have money flowing in. But it's really ineffective, because for all of our gridlock in democracies, the fact that you have different ideas, different parties, different sides, actually acts as a check and exposing waste and exposing malfeasance when it happens, unlike in authoritarian or totalitarian systems. Yes?
How come other countries like the U.S. or Canada with the resources don't?
Why do those countries with resources don't do? Because we have, as I said, an accepted consolidated democracy where we accept the rule of law, we accept the Constitution as a basis. There is an unwritten rule that has been proven in hundreds of different tests, different hypotheses tested, that if you are a consolidated democracy when you find natural resources, it actually helps you. If you're authoritarian or totalitarian when you do, it becomes what they call a resource curse. So, for example, Nigeria and Congo should be as rich as Finland or Belgium, with all their oil and their minerals and gold. But they had dictatorships when they found it, and all of the revenue are going into the pockets of a very, very few number of people. And then the rest of the world needs the minerals, and that's what we've cared about. Norway, Canada, the United States, and Britain were all solid democracies by the time we found oil and gas and minerals. So those have been put to very different and beneficial use. Norway today has more revenue per person than any other country in human history, by far. Norway, and because they've accumulated oil money, oil rich, yes. They have close to $1 trillion as we speak for 5 million people. Extra.
Like rich is richer and poor is poor. It's like the whole country
Yeah,
is pretty much
close
at
to
the same level.
close to $160,000 per person, man, woman, and child. But they've used it wisely because they were a consolidated democracy when they found it. The test case today, may be interesting, is, as Dr. Quay knows from, is Ghana, that has very much moved towards democracy. There's some problems with judiciary, some problems with corruption, but they made significant strides. Probably the most advanced country in Western Africa towards democracy. Had peaceful turnover elections, even though they were very hotly contested. And they have found oil. That is going to be a test case because they're not consolidated, and now they found riches. If they can continue to develop towards a stable democracy and harness those riches, that would be a very interesting case where you can see that even in the progress of becoming democracy, you can make use of those resources. Okay, thank you.